It's the 5th century BC. The Persian Empire, reeling from its defeats during the Greco-Persian Wars, is in shambles and losing its power in the Aegean Sea. Replacing it is the Greek city-state of Athens, which is beginning to create a small empire of its own. Concerned by this, other Greek states begin to fight Athens, hoping to keep it from becoming too powerful. But when a pause in the fighting comes, Athens regroups and sets its sights westward, towards the rest of the Mediterranean. In the center of the sea lies a powerful city, supplying Athens' enemies and acting as a gatekeeper for any regional power trying to expand. Here, at the city of Syracuse, a deeply important battle would commence, and the outcome would decide the fate of all Mediterranean civilizations. The future of Carthaginian, Persian, Greek, and Roman ways of life would be determined by the Battle of Syracuse. The Battle of Syracuse, also known as the Siege of Syracuse or the Sicilian Expedition, took place on the island of Sicily between 415 and 413 BC. Here, Athenian forces attempted to take the city and expand Athenian influence, while fighting the combined forces of Syracuse, Sparta, and other Greek city-states. The battle wasn't just important for the city, however, but also the power balance and development of societies across the Mediterranean. As a result, the Battle of Syracuse is the second entry on historian Sir Edward Shepherd Creasy's list for the 15 decisive battles of the world. In this video, I'll be looking at the historical context of the battle, the militaries fighting on both sides, and the battle itself, as well as analysis on the battle's impact on the world and what Creasy has to say about the battle. But in order to understand Syracuse and its significance, we need to understand what led to the battle in the first place. In the era before the battle, Persia attempted to invade and conquer Greece during the Greco-Persian Wars. But after defeats at Salamis and, more importantly, Marathon, see my video on the Battle of Marathon to learn more, the Persians were rebuffed and forced to retreat back to Asia. During this war, however, Persia had taken over the Attica Peninsula and forced the Athenians to sea. As a result, the Athenians became very skilled mariners, and their skill would help them in their expansion. They quickly developed the most powerful navy in the region and spent massive amounts of money and resources in building ships and training mariners, going so far as to increase their slave population and hire mercenaries to staff their navy. Because of this powerful navy, various Greek states across the Aegean relied on Athens' power for protection. While the wars with Persia were still raging, many city-states looked to Athens for help and formed a confederacy known as the Delian League, spanning across the Aegean coast. After the Persian threat was over, the League remained, mostly to use Athens' navy for protection from other city-states against invasion and pirates. However, the Athenians soon turned from benevolent protector to extortive mafioso. In return for the naval protection, Athens required the other states to pay tribute, much like how an empire requires its occupied territories to pay taxes to the capital. If any city-state failed to contribute its money and resources, the Athenians would lay waste to it. Athens was effectively an empire, and its leader, Pericles, encouraged Athenian military power and made sure the Athenians never forgot how powerful they were. To his credit, he also warned against too much expansion, especially when powerful foes were right next door. Eventually, the other major Greek powers began to grow concerned. Fearing that Athens would try and take over the rest of Greece, Sparta attacked in 431 BC, beginning the Peloponnesian War. Sparta, along with other major Greek city-states, like Corinth and Thebes, formed the Peloponnesian League. War raged across Greece for 10 years, until 421 BC, after the deaths of the main leaders of both Sparta and Athens. The two sides agreed to a 50-year truce. This treaty was overseen by the Athenian general Nicias. Nicias, while a good statesman, was known to be an indecisive general. He often would hesitate at key moments or simply make the wrong move. His poor leadership would have a major role to play years later at Syracuse. Hundreds of miles away, the city-state of Syracuse was one of the most powerful in the whole Mediterranean. It served as a crossroads for Greek, Roman, and Carthaginian culture, and over time had become a wealthy trading city. During the first leg of the Peloponnesian War, Syracuse had been giving aid to Sparta, which put them on the bad side of Athens. Further, neighboring Thessalian cities that were aligned with Athens had complained about Syracuse's invasions and expansion locally. These things gave Athens an ample reason to attack Syracuse, and after years of recouping its forces during the truce, Athens felt ready for more expansion once again. Furthermore, once they took Syracuse, they would be able to take the rest of Sicily and possibly even take Carthage in the Italian peninsula. But not all of the Athenian generals agreed with this. Ultimately, the invasion of Syracuse came down to 3 men. The first one, already mentioned, was Nicias, who had brokered the peace with Sparta and was strongly against an invasion of Sicily, fearing a renewal of war. The second general, Alcibiades, was strongly in favor of an invasion, while the third general, Lamachus, was far more moderate but favored an invasion along with Alcibiades. The issue decided, all 3 generals were nominated to lead the attack on Syracuse. Back in the city of interest, the Syracusans were not at all concerned about the rumors of Athenian invasion. The city's chief general, Hermocrates, laid out a solid case not to worry for the Syracusan leadership. The walls of Syracuse were widely seen as impenetrable. Being on the sea, they also had a powerful navy, which would have to be defeated to pose any real threat. The only way that Syracuse could feasibly fall was for them to be bested both on the sea and land. While the Athenians had a powerful navy, Hermocrates did not believe that their army was powerful enough to take the city. Further, Hermocrates himself was responsible for fending off Athenian forces 9 years earlier during a smaller conflict in Sicily. Because of his reassurances, the Syracusans did nothing to bolster their military and defensive resources. Nicias, meanwhile, was still opposed to an invasion, and in an attempt to dissuade the council, inflated the power of Syracuse, hoping that the cost of invasion would seem too high for the others. The council did believe his exaggeration, but his plan backfired, and instead of shrinking away, they dedicated a massive force to the island. His plan had backfired, and he would have to suffer the consequences. A force this large would leave Athens exposed closer to home. In the event of a renewal of the Peloponnesian War, Athens would be in serious trouble against Sparta. Not long before the voyage, however, statues of Hermes in Athens were found desecrated. As Hermes was the god of travel, there was suspicion that the act was in opposition to the Syracusan invasion. Surprisingly, the only one blamed for this was Alcibiades, who had quite the propensity for deviant behavior, and he was also the general most in favor of invasion. Alcibiades wanted to delay the invasion after this accusation, since he and all of his allies would be abroad, and only his enemies would have a say as to whether or not he was guilty. Eventually, he and the rest were compelled to leave, convinced that a successful military victory would help his chances. Finally, the 3 generals set off for Sicily. The voyage was quite uneventful, but instead of making right for Syracuse, which was not yet prepared for an attack, the Athenians landed at Rhegium, on the southern tip of Italy. After getting word of this, the Syracusans finally decided to prepare for battle. During this time, the Athenians moved to Sicily itself and landed at Catana, about 40 miles north of Syracuse on the eastern Thessalian coast. But soon after, the drama from Athens came calling. The council in Athens had in fact found Alcibiades guilty of desecrating the Hermes statues and demanded that he be arrested and brought back to Athens for sentencing. On the way back, however, the general was still in control of his own ship, and when he saw his chance, he broke course with his guard and headed for Sparta. Here, Alcibiades sought out an audience with the Spartan leadership and told them of Athens' master plan. Once they would take Syracuse, they would take all of Sicily, while also restricting Sparta's trade. From there, Athens would renew the war with Sparta and use their now expanded power to siege the city and take it by force, as Sparta had no walls to defend it from siege. The renegade general then asked Sparta to commit forces to help Syracuse, as the fall of the city would surely make Athens too powerful to be stopped. The Spartans heard his plea and eventually sent a low-powered general by the name of Gylippus. Gylippus was a low-born soldier and did not have much respect in Sparta. He is largely forgotten to history and doesn't get nearly as much attention as other Spartans like Leonidas or Brasidas, despite having a similar impact. Still, any Spartan general was a godsend to the Syracusans, as they were extremely well known for their bravery in combat. As for why the Spartans sent Gylippus instead of a more widely regarded high-powered general, it is believed that the Spartans perhaps didn't fully believe Alcibiades and his ideas of what the Athenians were going to do, but they still thought it was worth enough so that they should commit someone while still keeping the brunt of their forces ready at home in case of a mainland invasion. Meanwhile, the Athenians prepared to fight. Sending a naval convoy to Syracuse, they saw that the city was unprepared against an attack from the sea. The Athenians had found the correct time to attack. Luring the Syracusan forces up to Catana, the Athenians then sent a fleet to the Syracusan harbor and entrenched themselves waiting for their forces to return. When they did, they engaged in combat, with the Athenian positioning negating the Syracusans' powerful Tarentine cavalry. Eventually, the Athenian discipline won out, and the Syracusans retreated into the city. While it was a success for the Athenians, they decided to leave on their ships, not wanting to get into a protracted conflict. Their lack of cavalry also was a major weakness, as they were not able to pursue and finish off the Syracusans, and would be limited in an offensive capacity. Over the winter, little took place other than both sides trying to recruit allies, but the Athenians struck again in 414 BC, moving south towards Syracuse, seizing the Epipolae high ground overlooking the city, and building 2 forts to secure it. They began building a siege wall with a circular fort as a linchpin, so as to keep the Syracusans from being able to get out or getting reinforcements in. The Syracusans tried to cut them off, and a war of wall building ensued. The Athenians built 2 parallel walls headed south, roofed together with barracks inside, while the Syracusans built walls perpendicular so as to cut off any ability to close the walls. The Athenians also seized the harbor and launched another attack to take and destroy one of the Sicilian counterwalls. During this attack, the second general, Lamachus, was killed, and the Syracusans almost took the Epipolae plateau. With his death, the Athenians were left with Nicias, known for his ineptitude and lack of decisiveness. The initial successful attacks were thought to be the work of Lamachus, and without him, the number of Athenian successes became fewer and fewer. The Athenians finally rallied, however, and managed to drive the Syracusans back into their city. The building of the walls resumed, with the southern wall well on its way to being completed, and a wall to the north starting across towards the sea, soon to fully seal off the city. Finally, the Syracusans had realized that they could lose. Sensing this, the Syracusan leadership convened to vote on terms for surrender. During the meeting, however, a friendly ship barreled past the Athenian blockade. Once beaching, a Corinthian general came out and delivered some good news. The Spartans had decided to help. The news that a Spartan was coming to help them revived the hopes of Syracuse. As Alcibiades had told Sparta, the presence of a Spartan general will do more to save the city than a whole army. Indeed, the low-born Spartan general Gylippus had made for Sicily with a small force, but was able to raise more across the island. Heading towards Syracuse from the north, he was about to try and break through the Athenian defenses and give the besieged city a fighting chance. Throughout the battle for Syracuse, the force sizes changed, with military failures and reinforcements ebbing and flowing the numbers. For Athens, the initial plan was to send 60 galleys to Syracuse. After Nicias' exaggeration, however, they ended up committing 134 war galleys, along with 5,100 hoplites and even more irregular troops. In the spring of 414 BC, the Athenians also got a reinforcement of 650 cavalry, which they had lacked in their initial assault on Syracuse. The Syracusans themselves had an unknown number of infantry and ships, but the numbers are likely similar to the Athenians. They did, however, have 1,200 cavalry, which proved vital in the early part of the campaign. This unit, famously known as the Tarentine Cavalry, was one of the best in the Greek world, rivaled only by the Macedonians, Thracians, and other Thessalians. Gylippus, to his credit, only brought 4 galleys to carry his men, but when in Sicily he managed to recruit more forces. By the time he reached Syracuse, Gylippus had commanded 2,000 to 3,000 hoplites, along with at least as many irregulars and 200 cavalry. The ground forces of all the factions were largely similar. The hoplite troops were heavily armored spearmen, equipped with bronze armor covering the head, chest, and shins. The large hoplon shield was their staple, along with a dory spear usually 7 to 8 feet long. As a backup, the hoplites carried a xiphos short sword, or possibly a kopis instead. The hoplites usually arrayed themselves in a phalanx formation, 8 ranks deep and headed by a shield wall with bristling spears. Irregular troops consisted of various mercenaries and lightly armored units that usually served as skirmishers and flankers. These units usually armed themselves with ranged weapons such as javelins, bows, and slings. The cavalry of the Greek world were armed similarly to hoplites, and with hoplon shields and dory spears, as well as bronze armor for the rider and sometimes for the horse. At sea, the Greeks used ships called triremes. Triremes, also referred to as war galleys, were named for the 3 rows of oarsmen that propelled the boat. The trireme also had a bronze ram at the front used for damaging enemy ships, as well as sails for favorable wind conditions. About 120 feet in length and able to move at speeds of up to 10 knots, triremes were extremely effective vessels for their time. Made out of wood, they were usually quite agile yet able to carry a large crew. The average trireme crew was about 200 men, mostly made up of oarsmen, captains, and sailors. The remainder were made up of ranged fighters, hoplites, and marines. These marines were armed similarly to hoplites, but usually had smaller shields and a lenothorax chest covering, which was lighter and provided less protection but more mobility. These huge crews came at a cost, however, and the major downfall of the trireme was that it had to resupply on land on a daily basis. Keep this in mind, as it will play a big role in Syracuse. During naval battles, triremes would travel in a formation similar to a phalanx and ram into enemy ships to damage them. Ranged fighters would do their best to thin out the enemy's crew, and eventually the 2 ships would draw close and the crews would board the opposing ship. In terms of differences between Spartan and Athenian militaries, the differences are largely in ethos rather than equipment. The Spartans were one of the most effective infantry fighters in military history, and were trained from the age of 7 to fight and do nothing but fight. As a result, they were extremely disciplined, brave, and stubborn, often fighting to the last man. Not only were they extremely skilled in fighting in formation, they were also known for their abilities in hand-to-hand martial arts. They were so good at this, in fact, that they were barred from competing in the Olympics. Even with naval warfare, the Spartans opted to close the distance and board an enemy ship, since their infantry was almost always superior. The Athenians, by contrast, favored naval warfare more and invested more into building triremes than building a large army. During naval engagements, the Athenians opted for ranged battle more, using archers to kill enemy crew before boarding. The Athenian soldiers were also conscripted, and while at Syracuse they were battle-hardened and disciplined, they paled in comparison to the Spartans. The battle took place around the city of Syracuse on the southeastern coast of Sicily. The main part of the city was on a small island on the northern end of the harbor, with the rest of the city on the northern part of the harbor surrounded by walls. At the southern end of the mouth of the harbor was the area of Plemmyrium, and further inland was the holy site of Olympias. West of the harbor was a large plains area with a couple marshes, and the Anubis River running inland, then curving north only to move west once more. The most important piece of terrain at the Battle of Syracuse was the Epipoli Plateau that overlooked the city. The cliff face elevated this area over the rest of the land, and this high ground stretched all the way northwest to Labdalum. West of this, there was a pass, known as the Euryalus Pass, that served as the primary route to the north of the island and onto the Epipoli. As for the positions of the various forces, the main Athenian camp was on the western coast of the harbor, as well as an Athenian-controlled fort at Labdalum in the northeast of the Epipoli, and a fort that served as the linchpin for the Athenian siege walls. To the south, the double Athenian wall had been built, which also served as barracks. To the north, Athenian efforts to finish the encirclement were less complete. The Syracusans and their allies controlled the city of Syracuse, with the Spartans coming in from the north towards the Euryalus Pass. Both navies occupied the harbor, but Athens had the upper hand in numbers as well as ability. The Athenians also were cutting off the Syracusans from resupply and effectively controlled the sea. With Gylippus approaching, Syracuse finally had a glimmer of hope. Fortunately for the Spartans, Nicias had foolishly left the Euryalus Pass unguarded, and they were able to slip by. In an attempt to end the campaign as quickly as possible, the Spartans then moved to the south wall and attacked the Athenian forces there. This was unsuccessful, but due to Nicias' incompetence, they were able to regroup and slip around the north siege wall to join the main Syracusan force. From here, Gylippus began the construction of a counterwall to the north. Next, he ordered an attack on the Athenian south wall, but this was just a diversion. A larger force seized the northern Athenian siege wall and moved across the Epipoli to seize the Athenians' fort at Labdalum, where most of their supplies and money was kept. The Athenians were now at a disadvantage, only being relegated to the plains below the Epipoli and their fortifications on the south wall. They were cut off from escape by land as well, but still had the sea to aid them. Replacing the Labdalum fort they had lost, the Athenians set up a new stronghold at Plemmyrium, at the southern mouth of the harbor. This was a poor decision, however, as the Syracusans then camped a force at the holy site of Olympias and cut Nicias' forces in half. To make things worse, a fleet of Corinthians, Sparta's main ally against Athens, came to aid the Syracusans with 2,000 more men. Seeing that their efforts in Syracuse weren't going as well as they had hoped, Athens did the logical thing and attacked Sparta directly, reigniting the Peloponnesian War. The spring of 513 BC rolled around, and things heated up once more. Sparta had sent additional reinforcements, and the whispers of good news convinced other allies such as Thebes and Boeotia to send troops as well, further bolstering the Syracusans' numbers. On the mainland of Greece, Sparta had retaliated against Athens and began destroying crops and villages on the Attica Peninsula. Nicias, meanwhile, was at his weakest point and begged Athens to withdraw him from the island. But instead of withdrawing from Syracuse and focusing on the threat to their own territory, the Athenians sent an additional 73 galleys, 5,000 hoplites, and even more irregular troops to aid Nicias. Along with them came Demosthenes, the finest Athenian general of the Peloponnesian era. Having defeated Spartan forces regularly in the first part of the war, he was a significant upgrade from Nicias. But before his arrival, things only got worse for the Athenian expedition. Gylippus teamed up with Hermocrates and led a bold two-pronged night attack on the Athenians at Plemmyrium. Hermocrates sent a force of 80 ships to attack the Athenians, but he was intercepted and effectively defeated. While the ground forces were watching the battle at sea, however, The Spartans snuck up on them from behind and took their positions, once again weakening Nicias. A few more skirmishes by both sides were inconclusive, until one day the Syracusan navy, with their supply-guzzling triremes, had to return to the harbor to resupply and feed their crews. Seeing that it was safe, the Athenian navy did the same. But just then, Gylippus struck again and decimated the Athenian forces while they were eating, destroying 7 of their galleys. The harbor was now effectively in the hands of Syracuse, and the Athenian morale was at an all-time low. But just when all hope was lost again, Demosthenes arrived and bolstered the Athenian forces. Demosthenes, being an effective general, decided to attack the Syracusans right away. But this attack failed. Deciding to take a page out of Gylippus's book, he planned his next attack at night. It was here that the outcome of the campaign would be decided. Leading a combined force of 10,000 men, Demosthenes attacked the Syracusans at the Euryalus Pass. This time he succeeded and took the pass along with the Lebdalum fort. Ambitiously, he moved across the Epipolae towards Syracuse, routing enemy forces in his way. He made it all the way to the counterwall, and panic had spread amongst the Syracusan forces. But one formation of Boeotian hoplites, sent earlier that year to aid Syracuse, stood firm and started to beat back the Athenians, who by this point had started to break ranks themselves. The Boeotians began to push the Athenians back, just as Gylippus rallied his forces and joined them. The tides had turned, and the disorganized Athenians now fled from the disciplined Spartans, Boeotians, and Syracusans. To add to the chaos of the night, more Athenian forces were making their way down to the counterwall, and when they saw their comrades running at them in the night, they mistook them for enemies, and fratricide ensued. The defenders of Syracuse, now moving full steam ahead, drove the routed Athenians back off the Epipolae, many falling off the cliffs to their deaths. In the morning, the remainder of the Athenian forces aimlessly wandered the plains, only to be run down by the Syracusan cavalry. When it was all said and done, 2,500 Athenians had been killed, and even now Demosthenes wanted to retreat. With the Athenian forces decimated and their control of the harbor waning, Demosthenes called for an evacuation. Since the Athenians were so near to the swamps of Syracuse, malaria had begun to spread among their forces, and the city seemed unwinnable. Nicias, however, once again made the worst decision possible by deciding to stay, convinced by his spies that Syracuse was about to fall. They remained at their camp, pestered by attacks and disease, until eventually Nicias changed his mind. But when night came and an escape was easily in their reach, a lunar eclipse had happened, and the Athenian soothsayer recommended that they should not travel for another 27 days. This only made things worse for the Athenians, especially their navy. The Syracusans, now bolstered by opportunistic Sicilian armies, attacked the Athenian navy and destroyed 18 ships in one day and killed one of their commanders. To ice the cake, they then formed a blockade with chains and anchored ships to trap the Athenians. Finally, Nicias gave the order to try and break the Syracusan blockade, and the naval battle turned into a close-quarters mess involving over 200 ships. At the end of the day, the Athenians had failed and were once again sent back to shore. With a last-ditch attempt, the Athenians attempted to retreat by land back to Catana, going the long way around the Epipolae and the pass. Here, Gylippus pulled one last trick on the Athenians. Realizing that his men were drunk from celebrating their victory, he sent fake envoys to Nicias to inform him that Syracuse was about to surrender. The ruse worked, and the Athenians stayed another day, allowing the Spartans to sober up and block their escape. Over the next 6 days, 20,000 Athenian soldiers moved north to escape, being harassed by Syracusan forces the whole time. Eventually, Demosthenes broke off and was captured, while Nicias lasted a little longer. After being encircled, He broke out and led his men to a river to drink. The Syracusans were waiting on the cliff across the water and decimated his now defenseless force, while Gylippus and the Spartans came up behind them. The two generals were captured and executed, and of the 20,000 Athenian soldiers who left, only 6,000 were still alive. The survivors were promptly sold into slavery to work at the quarries that would supply the city that they had tried so hard to capture. The Athenian defeat at Syracuse played a large role in losing the Peloponnesian War for the Athenians. While they would manage to hold on for a few more years, the massive amount of forces dedicated to Syracuse weakened the Athenians too much. Sparta and the Peloponnesian League would go on to defeat Athens and end the war in 404 BC. But the larger impact comes not with the Peloponnesian War, but with the halt of Athenian expansion. If Athens took Syracuse, they would easily take the rest of Sicily. From there, they would likely be able to conquer Carthage, which was quite weak at that time, and even a sizable part of the Italian peninsula, including Rome, while it was still weaker than the Greek states. Had this happened, the world would be quite different today. All the impacts of Rome on our world, from the prominence of the Latin language to the systems of government, would not exist, instead replaced by a pure Greek culture. A quote by Thomas Arnold, a contemporary of Crusade, sums this up quite well. The Romans knew not how deeply the greatness of their own posterity and the fate of the whole Western world were involved in the destruction of the fleet at Athens in the harbor of Syracuse. Had that great expedition proved victorious, the energies of Greece during the next eventful century would have found their field in the West no less than the East. Greece, and not Rome, might have conquered Carthage. Greek instead of Latin might be used at this day, the principal element of the language of Spain, France, and Italy, and the laws of Athens, rather than of Rome, might be the foundation of the law of the civilized world. While it may seem hard to believe, Athens was more than capable of taking over Rome at the time, as the Roman historian Livy acknowledges. As for Carthage, a much smaller Greek force a century later was almost able to take it. This at a time when the Greeks were much weaker and Carthage was much stronger. Athenian overextension can also serve as a cautionary tale, as we've seen multiple times in history, such as the Germans in World War II or Napoleon in the 19th century. When an empire expands too far, the consequence is usually a sudden collapse, often at a single battle. Stalingrad and Moscow serve similar historical functions as Syracuse, where the expeditionary force reaches its limit and is decimated, and the expansionary force is now too weak to maintain what it gained and quickly succumbs to outside force. This phenomenon seems to be ageless and can serve as a warning for other expanding powers in the world today, such as the US and China. Interestingly, the concept of the Thucydides trap also came out of the Peloponnesian Wars and is another historical phenomenon that could soon play out in the world again, but that's a subject for another video. Overall, while it might not be as important as Marathon, it is still very important for world history. Marathon saved Western culture more broadly, while Syracuse defined the nature of that Western culture. Roman history is the most obvious element here, as the Romans were responsible for an incredible amount of the modern world. Much of the English language is Latin, and virtually all of Western Europe has Latin as its main lingual root. Concrete, the Julian calendar, aqueducts, and a highly refined infrastructure were all lasting contributions of Rome as well. Much of Western law and government is Roman in origin, from habeas corpus to the concept of a republic, to the presumption of innocence. The size and organization of Rome allowed for Christianity to become a powerful religion and for post-Roman societies to quickly move across its former territories. Without Rome, there would be no West, and without Syracuse, there would be no Rome. After the Athenian defeat, other Greek states came to power. One of them, Macedonia, would become a massive empire stretching from Egypt to India. and carry Greek culture across the world to consume other competing ones. But on the way, Greece's age-old enemy had to be defeated. At the Battle of Arabella, the dominant culture of antiquity would be decided and spread itself across the world unchallenged for millennia. So that's it for this video, guys. The next segment in the series will be on the Battle of Arabella, also known as the Battle of Gaugamela. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.